You are listening to the Senior Pastor Podcast, where four giants of the Restoration Movement walk us through the issues facing the church today. Your four hosts are Bob Russell, Don Wilson, Ken Idleman, and Scott Rawlings. Before we begin, a word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Brooke Brotzman, CEO and founder of Go Ministries. Go Ministries empowers local leaders to make disciples. After 30 years of leading this ministry, the next generation is taking it to a whole nother level. And I have had the privilege of starting a new area called Go Legacy, where we focus on pastoral care, resourcing new initiatives, and teaching and modeling kingdom generosity. If you'd like to learn more, please go to gomen.org. We all leave a legacy. What will your legacy look like?
Well, as many of you know, the average church in the United States averages about 60 attendees a week. And the evangelical church in America, according to most studies, is shrinking. However, the Stone Campbell movement, the Restoration movement, is growing. And so today I thought we'd talk to these four senior pastors about when your church is growing, what do you do? How to build teams, who to hire, when to hire, and unfortunately, who to fire and when to fire, because that's part of team building as well. Bob, I know when you started Southeast, it was a small church. It grew to over 20,000. Do you remember your first hire, who you brought on first onto the team?
I remember it very well. We grew to the place where we said we need a youth minister, and we were 250, 300 people. And this was in the era where multiple staffs were very rare. So it was just trial and error. And I said to our elders, I know just the guy. I went to school with this guy. He was a friend of mine. He's a year older than I am, and he's got a youth ministry in Georgia, and he's struggling a little bit for some reason. I think he's movable. Well, those should have been 3 strikes against you. Friend, older, ministry not going well. But he interviewed well, and he came, and we had a good time together, but he wasn't there very long before I discovered that his philosophy of youth ministry was different than mine. And rather than confront him, I kept tiptoeing around the edges. And as a result, we had eventually a real fallout. So our first hire was a disaster. And I began to learn through trial and error a little bit about hiring and who to hire and communication and guidelines and some of those essentials.
Don, what about you? Do you remember your first hire when CCV was growing?
Yeah, basically, I think what I found out was I want to hire somebody that can take things off of my plate as we grow. So I was more of the vision caster, and so I said, I think I need to get somebody that's more of an implementer or somebody that's more of an organizer. So that's what I did. I tried to go out and find somebody that could take my vision and put more of a skeleton around it so that we could implement the ministry and the vision.
Mm. And Ken, you're kind of in a unique position because you've been the senior pastor of a large church. You've also been the president of a Christian college. So you've had to hire and fire, not only ministers, but faculty, administrators, and so forth. Do you remember your first hire?
Well, I remember the first hire was when I was a senior pastor of Mount Pulaski Christian Church in Mount Pulaski, Illinois. It was a rural Illinois church outside of Lincoln, about 11 miles to drive into Lincoln. I was a full-time student and a full-time pastor of a church of about 250 at that time, and I was the only staff member. I remember preaching 2 services on Sunday morning and teaching Bible school in between and teaching Wednesday night. So I was the only one until we hired a part-time youth minister, and he did not have much of a work ethic, and I found that I worked harder. I had more to do with him as a part-time student pastor. So So I think it was about a 9-month sojourn, and I met him years later, and we laughed about our inexperience and our immaturity as a 21-year-old and a 20-year-old working together in a rural Illinois church.
And Dad, you've been in ministry since what, 1959?
It's before I can remember. I'm not certain.
Okay, but and I know that you were preaching before you became full-time. I think your first full-time job was as a youth minister. Is that correct, in Indiana?
Yeah, I was a youth minister even while I was in Bible college at under Tom Thurman there in Grayson. And then I left there and went to graduate school, and then had a little church in Western Kentucky in Nebo. Moses and I had that thing together. And anyway, and then I went to again under Tom at Second Church of Christ in Danville, Illinois. And then I was in First Christian Church in Columbus, Indiana, for a few years under Brother D.K. Smith, and so. And I considered myself to be the best youth minister that ever took a breath, and so I wanted to hire somebody that was as good as I was. And
you're still looking?
And that didn't turn out too well. That didn't turn out too well.
Well,
yeah.
To give kind of the backstory at Christ Community Church. Christ Community Church, Mom and Dad founded in 1970, and we had our first church split in 2016, led by the former youth minister. But that we won't get into all of that. But I know that, Dad, you have told me this in hiring and building teams, because if people who don't know, my dad spent roughly 20 years in the private sector in the steel industry. My dad would work he would study all day Saturday, preach Sunday morning, teach a Bible class on Sunday night, then drive to Columbus, get on an airplane, fly to Istanbul, Turkey, or India, or Germany, or South Korea, or Mexico, and work on, get home Friday night, and wash, rinse, repeat for year after year after year. But you learned a lot, Dad, did you not, about building teams in the corporate world?
Yeah, it's a whole different situation. I'm not certain that what the church has done. I've got all kinds of, looking back through the years, I have all kinds of second guesses in my mind of how, of the areas where I really messed up with the best of intentions. But I had a tendency to hire because of need, and the one that came along said they were interested, because I've always tried to look for the fine good things in other people. And you have a tendency to miss what Bob was saying there. The facts are in front of you, and sometimes you just don't look at them. And I've been guilty of all those things more times than one, really.
Yeah, and Bob, going back to, okay, that was your first hire, but I've been to Southeast many times, so I know you have made many successful hires. What do you think went into that? When looking back, what have you learned about finding the right, to steal a phrase from leadership, putting the right person on the bus?
Well, I think 90% of being a good leader is hiring the right people, and that's not easy to do. I considered myself a high trust person, and I wanted to hire the right people and give them a few parameters and encourage them, and then they'll go and they'll carry the ball. But you make a wrong hire, and it's going to be a headache for you many times over. I had to acknowledge that I was not a good judge of character in an interview. And there were others on our elder board who were better at interview evaluations than I was. I evaluated two things. One was the past record of the person I was hiring. People will do in the future just about the same as they've done in the past. The second thing that I looked for was, what do the people who know this person best say about him or her? they'll give you in their resume some people to recommend them, and those people are going to give a positive recommendations. But I would find somebody in that community that I totally trusted, and I would say, would you find out what you can find out about this person, and then get back to me and tell me their strengths and their weaknesses. And then I would get, I think, a more honest evaluation of what that person could do well and where they were weak. And I was in a better position to make a judgment.
Just a hitchhike on that. It's really true that that axiom that the best indicator of future performance is past performance. It's not the only indicator, but it's the best one. And when you're looking for staff, you want someone who understands that they are first and foremost a spiritual leader. And so assessing their spiritual life as best you can and their spiritual gifts will tell you a lot about their character. And character trumps competence, in my opinion. And yet it's not either or, it's both and. And so character and competence and making sure you're hiring a spiritual leader, you're adding someone to the team, and then extend that kind of trust Bob was talking about. Cultivate an atmosphere of trust and grace and freedom. Trust them to do the job. Give them grace when they make a mistake, and give them the freedom to develop their ministry in a unique way. I think those are the kinds of things that I would think about in adding a teammate.
And thank you for that, Ken. Don, what did you learn through your years of what to look for in a hire?
Well, I made some mistakes. I coached college basketball and I played college basketball, and so I found as a coach, if let's say from 0 to 5, if he's a 3, I felt if I coached him, I could at least get him to a 4 after a year or two and working on his deficiencies. And so I kind of took that same attitude into hiring, that instead of getting a 5, I would say, you know what, I think this he's a 3, but I think if I work with him enough, I can make him a 4 or 5. And I found out that didn't work. Like Ken kind of said, past results is an indication of future results. So what I started doing was I realized my wife had better discernment than I did on hiring, because she knew what I was like to work with because she'd lived with me. And so what we started doing was we would interview couples together, and I would try to ask questions to get them to argue in an interview, the husband and wife, because I wanted to see which one was the strongest personality. And then on the way home, I'd simply ask my wife, do you think that person can fit and work on my team or not? And I found out that her discernment over time was better than mine. The one question that was huge for me, because I was a youth pastor when I started out, and hiring younger staff, the key question for me in hiring for somebody, I would simply say, tell me about your relationship with your father, and I would just be quiet and listen to what they said. And I found out that most people that have a good relationship with their father, girls or guys, especially guys, they can handle direction pretty well. But if they had a bad relationship with their father, they could be 30 years old, and I felt like I was talking to a junior high kid. It was always, why? And so that was a key question for me. Just tell me about your relationship with your father.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to take a minute to hear a word from our sponsors. Thanks to Go Ministries. Make sure you check them out to help form your legacy.
Hi, I'm Brooke Brutzman, CEO and founder of Go Ministries. Go Ministries empowers local leaders to make disciples. After 30 years of leading this ministry, I've turned it over to the next generation and couldn't be more pleased with how they're leading and all they're doing. That allows me to focus on a new area called Go Legacy, where we focus on pastoral care, resourcing new initiatives, and kingdom generosity. And folks, let's face it, if you're connected at all with the church, whether a regular attender, an elder, and certainly if you're on staff, you see the pressures that our leaders are under. It is an incredible burden that they bear and often bear alone. Go Ministries have been privileged to walk alongside hundreds of local leaders right here serving in our own churches. And we want to do more through counseling, encouragement, and equipping those pastors. But that doesn't happen without new initiatives and new resources. And that brings us to kingdom generosity. Folks, God owns it all, and we need to live into that each and every day. Please go to gomen.org and ask yourself, what will your legacy look like?
I think the question, though, that I probably didn't ask years ago, but I would ask more recently is, tell me about your call to ministry. Because I find that I just assumed years ago that if somebody went to Bible college and so on, that God called them into ministry. But my feeling lately is a lot of young people are in ministry not because they're called, but they see it as more of a career. Mm-hmm. And if you see your ministry as more of a career or a job rather than a calling, they're going to have a hard time of doing the extra, because especially if it's on their day off. And that was just, so when I grew up in those small churches, somebody had a funeral or whatever, or a major emergency, there was no such thing as a day off. But today, a lot of people will say, I'm sorry, I can't do that because it's my day off. And so I think understanding, are you called to ministry, is an important thing that I assumed earlier on.
Bob, what about you? What do you think of that?
Well, I would say something else. Ken mentioned earlier the importance of character over competence, and I agree with that 100%. Every time somebody was super talented and we blinked a little bit on character, it came back to burn us. But there's a virtue that I think is really important in evaluating a future employee, and that is humility. I'm not talking about insecurity, but is this a humble person? Sir Laurence Olivier was asked what it made to be a good actor. He said, confidence enough to pull it off and humility enough to prepare. And there needs to be a balance, but an arrogant person is going to turn people off in the course of time. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble, and people do too. And I think there needs to be humility on the part of the person you're hiring so that he has a submissive spirit. That's what Don's talking about when he says, how did you respond to your father? Do you have a humble spirit that you can take directions? I think humility also needs to be a part of the person doing the hiring, because we need to say, you know what, I'm not always the best at evaluating somebody. I'm going to listen to the advice of others, like Don was talking about, listening to the advice of his wife.
Yeah.
You know, Matt, one of the things that I learned 900 years ago, I was on the board of Toronto Christian Mission, and Gene Doolin had a rule there. Everybody that they hired and brought on board, they hired an outfit out of Chicago, give a psychological test to them. I'd never been, that was all new to me, and I watched, and we hired this one guy. The board, with his recommendation, hired this guy. Really a nice person, personable, and he absolutely failed the psychological test, but we hired him anyway. And within 3 years, the ministry was in crisis. I think, sometimes we think that in this world we live in, that if we're spiritual, we got all the answers. Sometimes we need to look out beyond ourselves and actually use some of those tools in hiring. I think it would save some heartache. It would at least give us some red flags that we might not catch because of our personality and that tendency that ministers have to look for the best in people. We just do that. And that's one of the ways that you help build a great church. People need encouraging, and you want to be an encourager.
Matt,
Yeah.
you said that we're talking to a lot of people that have smaller churches, which many of them, they are the only employee, or it might be one or two. I think another mistake I made, even when our church was larger, a good volunteer doesn't necessarily make a good staff person. And I made some mistakes there because that volunteer was faithful. They were dependable. They got it done. But when I hired them, they could not multiply themselves through other people. They couldn't recruit and train others because they were really good at doing it themselves. And so that was a mistake I made, was that assuming that just because they were a faithful, great volunteer, they would make a good staff person.
You know, you guys are younger than I am, and we've all kind of been beating ourselves up just a little bit on what goes on here. But you know, we need to be reminded that in Scripture, the Apostle Paul had some of the same problems. Demas went back into the world. There were we're going to make mistakes when we do the best we can, and so I think we need to figure out and maybe even make suggestions to these younger guys that are listening. Help them put together some kind of a system that they can use based on our experience from the past. Because they're going to be doing the same thing. I through the years, have practiced in my life the same way that I did my golf. I had a tendency to practice my mistakes, and we need to get some of that behind us and say, okay, here's what we need to put on the table for other people as a result of our failures and so on and so forth. We need to put something positive out here for folks to hang their hat on.
I agree, but I do want to piggyback on what's been said as far as humility, because Dad, I've heard you say this for years. You would have people come in who had been converted on Saturday night. I've heard you tell this story many times. Converted on Saturday night, come in Sunday morning, say, God's called me to preach. And your response was, great, go clean the toilets. And if they weren't willing to clean the toilets, they weren't ready for ministry, which goes back to the humility thing, that, what are you willing to do? And do you just want the spotlight, or, do you want to do ministry? So, Ken, speaking of humility, you're the one here who's dealt with academics who are not known for their humility, generally speaking. So we do have Christian college presidents who listen to this. What did you look for when you were looking for, if you had to replace faculty or so forth, what were you looking for?
Well, I think picking up where and transition from what you're saying about humility and a servant spirit, assessing that is very, very important. And the servant spirit we look for, and in the process of the interview, but also in the process of recommendations from others who've worked with them in the past. And the people who work hard at ministry are the kind of people that you want on your team. And if a faculty member is entitled, or if he feels like it's not his job to help set up chairs for an alumni banquet, or I was teased because I'd walk across the campus and I would police the campus as I would go from place to place. I'd pick up paper, trash, and people had fun with that. But that was one way I could model servanthood and a sense of ownership of the mission, and a commitment to the quality that we wanted to demonstrate in our program. So, yeah, I think that servant spirit and the humility are vitally important for longevity. I worked with one of the most genuinely humble men in the world, in Dr. Lynn Gardner. He was academic dean for 17 years while I was president. And I'm telling you, he was a master teacher. He was a great writer who's left a great legacy in the books that he's written. He was not a great self-promoter, but he had that trait. And although we were very different personalities, we really worked in tandem well together. And the same with Mark Scott, my closest coworker at the college. Were the academic deans, and I was blessed to have men who were servant-spirited, genuinely humble, and spiritually influential.
Don't you think, Ken, what you mentioned there about they were different personalities than you? When we hire, it doesn't mean we're trying to duplicate ourselves. That we need to hire people who are strong in areas where we are weak. And maybe they aren't an outgoing personality, but if you're looking for somebody to do administrative work, you need to find somebody who has a passion for details, and be willing to hire somebody who's strong in the area where you're not strong, and then delegate and get out of the way.
Yeah, I always conceived of myself as the captain of the team, not necessarily the star player that always had to have the ball and take all the shots, And so I think that is so true. And Don, I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. No, I think part of our personality depends on who we're going to attract as well. And so for me, I want somebody who's a self-starter. Because if they're not a self-starter, then I feel like I've always got to wind them up, and I want them to go for it. The problem that I think in hiring sometimes, we're not clear in the role that we want. And so if we don't give clear direction to an employee when we hire, then we come back and evaluate them and say, well, you didn't do what I told you to do. And they said, well, you weren't clear in what you asked me to do. So I think it kind of goes both ways. One of the mistakes that I made was confusing accomplishment with activity. I value accomplishment, results, but a lot of people I hired, as long as they were busy, they thought they were productive. And the reason why is my goals weren't specific enough that there was a difference from just being busy and being productive. And so part of that was my problem as the leader. And when I hired them, I did not give them clear direction.
And we're going to take a break here in just a minute, guys, before we kick off the second half of this. But going back to your point, Dad, what I'm hearing on a positive, for the process is, what I'm taking away from this is, one, Don's suggestion that you interview, especially if they're married, the couple, that you get to know them as a couple. I think that's important.
Who you sleep with has a lot of influence.
Yeah, it always has, doesn't it? Just preached on Samson a little while ago. And so what everyone else is saying about humility, and also, Bob, your recommendation that you don't just look to the references, you look beyond that. And looking for those red flags, looking for, all those things. I think those are all actually a positive, in the sense that those are things that a senior pastor or board of elders needs to look at when they're considering a new hire.
One of the things that I wondered if these fellows did is did somebody on your staff that you trust do an annual review? Because I think those things really can be helpful, and they couldn't be, because people do change. And I wondered if that's done, and if you provide a written job description for each one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what, Don, I don't want to speak for you, but you're saying within the job description, are you saying you need to give them concrete goals?
Oh, absolutely. But I think what's changed from the people I'm talking to now, working with millennials and Gen Z, you can't wait for a yearly evaluation. They want to know immediately once they do something, how did they do? So my advice to the younger generation we're working with today is you can't wait a year. You've got to give them immediate feedback after they do something, or at least have every 3 months a review, because they need that affirmation more than waiting for a whole year. One other thing I want to say, because the reason why I think it's so important to hire the couple is because my wife I never paid her. She was a full-time volunteer for my ministry for 50 years. But she felt like we were partners in ministry together. And the reason why you have to interview the couple is because many of the pastors' wives today, they want their own career. And so they're going to make it very clear, you're hiring my husband, but I'm going to be doing my career, so don't expect me to be involved in ministry responsibilities, which is okay, but you need to know that up front so that you don't have expectations for a pastor's wife that she doesn't have for herself. That, I believe, has changed over the years as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, folks, We're going to take a break here, but we will come back with another episode and continue this discussion on hiring and firing, building a solid church team.
This has been the Senior Pastor Podcast, a production of 1801 Media Incorporated. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.